The moment Louise Holloway stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1878, the dust rose around her boots like the territory itself was trying to swallow her whole, and she squared her jaw and dared it to try. She had exactly one dress to her name, a faded calico the color of dried sage, mended twice at the hem and once along the left shoulder seam, and tucked beneath the fabric at her hip, riding in a worn leather holster she had stitched together herself from remnants of a saddle bag, sat a Colt single-action army revolver loaded with 6 rounds. She had fired it twice in her life. Both times she had hit what she was aiming at. That felt like a reasonable average. Caldwell in the summer of 1878 was a cattle town in the truest and roughest sense of the word. It sat just north of the Kansas border with Indian Territory, and the Kishom Trail ran right through its heart like a spine, bringing with it longhorns and cowboys and all manner of men who smelled of 3 weeks in the saddle and spent their wages in a single night. The streets were packed dirt baked hard as brick. The storefronts leaned against one another the way tired men lean against a fence. Saloon music spilled out into the afternoon air even before the sun had begun its descent, and somewhere down the main road a dog was barking at something it had no business barking at. Louise stood on the boardwalk beside her single carpet bag and looked at all of it with the steady, measuring gaze of a woman who had survived worse places than this, and intended to survive this one too. She was 24 years old. She had grown up in Missouri, in a small town called Colt, where her father had run a dry goods store until a fire took it, and the debt that followed took him, leaving her mother to take in laundry and Louise to take in whatever lessons the world was willing to teach. She had worked in a boarding house, then in a millinery shop, then for 6 months as a telegraph operator, until the man who owned the office decided the telegraph was better operated without women present. She had been offered a marriage proposal by 2 different men in Holt, and she had turned both of them down with great politeness and even greater firmness, because she had not come this far in her life to anchor herself to a man just because the alternative was harder. She had come to Caldwell because she had answered an advertisement in the Kansas City Journal. A man named Henry Pratt was seeking a schoolteacher for the small community of Ember Flat, which lay 17 miles southwest of Caldwell along the Chicaskia River. The position offered room and board in the home of the town's reverend, and a salary of $22 a month, which was not generous but was more than she was earning in Missouri, and more importantly it was far away from Missouri, which had recently become relevant. The thing about Missouri that had become relevant was a man named Douglas Farrow, who believed that Louise owed him something on account of a night when she had, by his accounting, encouraged his affections. Louise's accounting of that same night was considerably different, and when she had made her accounting clear to him by way of a firm refusal, he had not received it well. He had received it badly enough, in fact, that she had found it wise to remove herself from the same county as Douglas Farrow with some urgency. So here she was, 1 dress, 1 bag, 1 loaded pistol, the Kansas sun overhead like a brand. The stagecoach driver climbed down from his box and handed her bag to her without ceremony, already turning back to his horses before she had properly gripped the handle. A man beside her on the boardwalk, red-faced, hat pushed back on his head, smelling powerfully of whiskey even at this hour, gave her a slow and thorough look that made the back of her neck tighten. "Stage doesn't go to Ember Flat," the driver said, not looking at her. "You'll need to arrange your own passage." "I know that," Louise said. "Thank you." She had known that. She had planned for that. What she had not entirely planned for was the fact that the man who was supposed to meet her at the stage stop, a Henry Pratt, who in his letter had described himself as the chairman of the Ember Flat School Board, was nowhere to be seen. She waited 20 minutes. She walked to the only hotel on the street and inquired about the cost of a room, which was 40 cents a night and which she could afford for exactly 2 nights before her money ran out entirely. She walked back to the stage stop. Still no Henry Pratt. It was while she was standing there with her bag at her feet and her hands on her hips, doing the arithmetic of her situation, that she first heard the voice. "You look like somebody stood you up." It came from the left, from the shadow of an overhang on the livery stable, and when she turned toward it, she found a man sitting on an upturned barrel with his boots crossed at the ankle, and his hat tilted forward over his eyes in the attitude of a man who had been watching the street for some time. He was somewhere in his late 20s. She guessed perhaps 28 or 9, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar, and the kind of jaw that looked like it had been assembled from purpose rather than accident. He wore the clothes of a working cowboy, trail-worn and sun-faded, and there was a long-handled rope coiled at his hip that told her he had not come to town merely for the pleasure of sitting on barrels. "I beg your pardon," Louise said. "Standing there with that look," he said, not moving the hat, "like you're calculating something and you don't like any of the answers." "That is a remarkably accurate description of my situation," she said, "but I don't believe I invited the observation." He pushed the hat back then, and she saw his eyes for the first time. They were a warm, steady brown, the color of creek water over good flat stones, and they held an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite concern, but something that lived between the two. "Clayton Underwood," he said, and touched the brim of his hat. "Louise Holloway," she said, because she saw no reason not to be civil. "You waiting on someone, Miss Holloway?" A man named Henry Pratt, who was supposed to meet the stage from Kansas City. Clayton Underwood was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the tone of a man choosing his words with some care, "Henry Pratt passed away about 3 weeks ago. Heart, they think. Word might not have reached you in time." She stared at him. "He's dead." "Yes, ma'am. The man who hired me to teach school in Ember Flat is dead." "I'm afraid so." She breathed in slowly through her nose and let the air out through her teeth. The man who smelled of whiskey was still watching her from the other side of the boardwalk. She turned her back on him deliberately and looked at Clayton Underwood, who was now sitting up a little straighter on his barrel with an expression that suggested he was prepared, if needed, to be useful. "Do you know anything about the school?" She asked, "Whether they intend to fill the position." "I know they still need one," he said. "Pratt was the one organizing it, but the need doesn't go away just because Pratt did. There's probably 40 children in that valley who haven't had a proper teacher in 2 years. And do you know anyone in Ember Flat who might be able to confirm my employment and arrange transport?" "My ranch is 7 miles east of Ember Flat," he said. "I was heading back that way tomorrow morning. I could take you to town and introduce you to Reverend Aldous, who was working with Pratt on the school. He'll know what to do." She studied him for a moment with the frank, appraising look that a woman in her position could not afford to abandon. He met it without flinching, which she noted, and without any of the oily eagerness that men who wanted something from women typically showed, which she also noted. "What are you doing in Caldwell?" she asked. "Picking up wire fencing and a new pump handle for the well. Neither of those things require me to have bad intentions toward strangers." She almost smiled. "Almost." "All right," she said. "I'll take you up on the offer of an introduction. As for the transport, I'd prefer to pay my share." "It's a buckboard with an empty passenger seat," he said. "What you'd pay wouldn't cover the splinters." She did almost smile then, and she let him see just the edge of it. "I'll need to stay at the hotel tonight," she said. "I can be ready at whatever time you suggest." "Sunrise," he said. "I want to be past the river crossing before the afternoon heat sets in." "Sunrise," she agreed and picked up her bag. She was 3 steps away when she heard him say, behind her, in a tone that was entirely sincere, "Miss Holloway, you arrived in the Kansas territory with one dress, a single bag, and I'm willing to bet there's a firearm somewhere under that skirt, given the way you were watching that fellow across the street. That makes you the most prepared woman I have ever met." She stopped walking. She did not turn around immediately. She let herself feel the small, warm flicker of something in her chest, something she had not felt in a long time and was not yet ready to name, and then she turned. "6 rounds," she said, "and I've been shooting since I was 12. He smiled then, and it transformed his face in a way that she filed away carefully, the way you file away something you know you are going to want to find again. She turned back toward the hotel and walked away with her bag. And she did not look back again, because she was practical enough to know that looking back at things twice was how you tripped over the present. She paid her 40 cents for a room at the hotel, which turned out to be a small box of a space with a washstand and a window that looked out at the back alley and a bed that sagged in the middle but was clean enough. She washed her face and hands, rebraided her hair, shook out her dress as best she could, and sat on the edge of the bed with the Colt in her lap, not because she expected trouble in the night, but because the weight of it was familiar, and familiar things helped her think. She thought about Douglas Farrow back in Missouri, and then she actively stopped thinking about Douglas Farrow because he did not deserve the real estate in her mind. She thought about 40 children in a valley without a teacher for 2 years, and that thought sat better. She thought about Clayton Underwood's Creekwater eyes and the thing he had said about the pistol, and she found that she was not entirely certain what to do with that thought, so she set it aside and let sleep take her. She was up before the roosters, dressed and packed and downstairs with her bag before the first gray light had properly established itself in the eastern sky, because she had not survived the past several years of her life by being unprepared for mornings. Clayton Underwood was already at the livery stable when she arrived, hitching a good-boned bay horse to a solid-looking buckboard wagon that had seen honest use but was in decent repair. He had a second horse, a compact gray mare, tied to the back. He was wearing a fresh shirt, she noticed, and had taken a razor to his jaw. He handed her up onto the wagon seat with a hand that was rough-calloused and steady, the hand of a man who used it for work, and she settled herself on the wooden bench with her bag at her feet as he climbed up the other side and unwound the reins. They pulled out of Caldwell as the first light broke over the flat Kansas horizon in a wash of copper and rose that made the prairie look, for just a few minutes, like something from a painting rather than a fact of geography. "Did you sleep?" he asked after they had gone perhaps a mile. "Well enough," she said. "Did you?" "I don't sleep much when I'm in town," he said. "Too many people making noise about things that could wait until morning." She could appreciate that. "How long have you had your ranch?" 3 years, he said. Bought the land in '75 when it was going cheap because the government surveys were still uncertain, and most men didn't want to put money into something that might shift under them. I figured I'd rather bet on the land than on the surveyors. That's a practical way to think about it. It's the way my father raised me, he said. He ran a livery back in Tennessee, taught me that the thing holding the animal is less important than understanding the animal. You can fix a bad rope. You can't fix a bad reed. She turned that over. You're from Tennessee, born there. I came west after the war was settled. I was young, but I was old enough to know that what the war had done to Tennessee and what it had done to my family meant there wasn't much left in Tennessee for me. He said it without self-pity, in the tone of a man who had finished his accounting of that particular chapter and moved on. She understood that tone. Missouri did something similar to me, she said, and left it at that for the moment. He didn't push, which was another thing she noted in his favor. The prairie rolled out ahead of them in long, golden waves of bluestem grass, and a red-tailed hawk was making slow circles in the warming air above the trail, and they drove in a silence that was, she realized after a while, genuinely comfortable. It was a rare thing, a comfortable silence with a person you had only just met, and she noticed it the way you notice the weather when it finally turns good after a long spell of bad. About an hour into the drive, the terrain began to change. The flat grassland gave way to something with more textured, gentle swells and cuts, the occasional draw where willows gathered around a trickle of water, the blue line of the Chicaskia River appearing in the middle distance through stands of cottonwood. The light had gone from copper to clean gold, and the heat of the day had not yet asserted itself. "Tell me about Ember Flat," she said. "It's small," he said. "Maybe 120 people. Ranchers mostly, with a few farmers mixed in. There's a general store run by a man named Cowpersmith who believes he charges fair prices, and is wrong about that in my opinion. There's Reverend Aldis's church, which doubles as the meeting hall for anything official, There's a blacksmith named Tomas Reyes who is the most competent man within 40 miles and is compensated poorly for it. There's a saloon just one which keeps the peace considerably compared to Caldwell. He paused. And there used to be a school. What happened to the school? The building burned down 2 winters ago. Not from malice, just a stovepipe that hadn't been properly cleaned. They've been using the back room of the church ever since, but nobody's had the authority or the resources to formalize anything since old Pratt got the school board together. Pratt was the kind of man who kept things organized through pure stubbornness, and without him it's been slow going. Who will make the decision about whether I'm hired? Formally, the school board, which right now consists of Reverend Aldous, a rancher named Frank Desmond who I have mixed feelings about, and a woman named Mabel Cowpersmith, that's the storekeeper's wife, who is formidable in a way that I respect considerably. And informally. He glanced at her sideways, and there was a slight curve at the corner of his mouth. Informally, you'll need to convince Reverend Aldous that you're serious and Mabel Cowpersmith that you're capable of handling those 40 children. And if you manage both of those things, Frank Desmond's opinion will align itself accordingly because Frank Desmond votes with whoever he thinks is going to win. That is a candid assessment. You asked. I did, she said. I appreciate it. The road dipped down toward the river crossing, and Clayton guided the bay horse into the ford with a practiced ease, reading the current and the footing in the way that men who had done this many times read it, with their hands and their weight more than their eyes. The water came up around the wagon wheels but not over the bed, and the horse pushed through it steadily and climbed the far bank without drama. "You're good with horses," she said, as they came up out of the crossing. "They were the first friends I had in Kansas," he said simply, and she thought that was one of the more honest things she had heard a man say in quite some time. They reached Ember Flat by mid-morning. It was exactly as he had described it, small, sun-baked, modest in every way, with the look of a place that had not decided yet whether it was going to become something or remain exactly this. The main street was unpaved and wide enough for 2 wagons to pass, lined with false-fronted buildings that projected an optimism slightly larger than the reality behind them. Children were visible, 2 in the yard of one of the houses, 3 more playing with a dog near the stable, and several adults paused in their morning business to watch the buckboard come in. They drew up in front of the church, which was a plain white building with a modest steeple and a door painted the dark red of dried cherries, and Reverend Aldous came out before they had properly stopped, as though he had been watching for the wagon. He was a lean, gray-haired man of perhaps 60, with sharp blue eyes behind spectacles and the kind of face that had spent a lot of years listening to people. He looked at Clayton and nodded, and then he looked at Louise, and his eyebrows rose with an expression that mixed surprise with what she chose to interpret as hope. "Reverend," Clayton said, stepping down. "This is Miss Louise Holloway. She came in on yesterday's stage in response to Henry Pratt's advertisement for a schoolteacher." She didn't know about Henry. "Oh, my dear," the Reverend said, and his voice was genuine with apology. "I'm so sorry. We should have gotten word out. We should have, well, there's been a great deal of confusion since Henry passed. I'm Elias Aldous. Please come inside." The inside of the church was dim and cool and smelled pleasantly of pine resin and old books. Louise sat in one of the pews and Reverend Aldous sat across from her, and Clayton stood near the door with his hat in his hands, and she told Reverend Aldous about herself, her background, her experience with children, her time as a telegraph operator which had given her a precise understanding of language, her conviction that education was not a luxury but a necessity, and that she believed this about as firmly as she had ever believed anything. Reverend Aldous listened with the attentive stillness of a man who knew how to hear more than words. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Miss Holloway, in 40 years of ministry I have met a very small number of people who convey certainty about their purpose when they speak. You are one of them. I would like you to stay." "I would like to stay," she said, "but I understand there is a board." "There is," he said, with the slight weariness of a man for whom committees had never been his favorite part of the work. "Mabel Cowpersmith will want to meet you. Frank Desmond will bluster and then agree. Leave the board to me for the moment. What I need to arrange first is where you'll live. My home is available, I have a spare room, and my housekeeper, Mrs. Birch, will be there, so all is proper, and the salary is still $22 monthly." "That is acceptable," Louise said. "All of it." She glanced at Clayton, who was watching her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, or at least not clearly enough to name it. It was something like admiration, but quieter than admiration usually sat in a man's face. It was the way you looked at something you were glad to see exist in the world. She looked away before she could think about it further. That afternoon, while Reverend Aldous arranged the room and Mrs. Birch, a square-shaped, kind-faced woman in her 50s, made tea and cut bread and generally communicated with her hospitality that Louise was welcome here, Clayton came by to say he was heading back to his ranch and would be in town on Saturday for supplies. "Thank you," Louise said, standing at the church gate. "For the ride, for the introduction." "I didn't do much," he said. "You did considerably more than nothing, Mr. Underwood." "Clayton," he said. She looked at him. The afternoon sun was directly behind him and she had to shade her eyes slightly, which meant she was looking up at him with her chin tilted, which was not an angle she particularly enjoyed because it felt like a disadvantage. She stepped to the side so the sun was not in her eyes. "Clayton," she said. "Thank you." He nodded, turned, untied the gray mare from the hitching post. He had left the buckboard at the livery, and swung up into the saddle with the ease of a man for whom horses were genuinely as natural as walking. He looked down at her for just a moment, and then he said, "I hope Ember Flat treats you right, Miss Holloway." "It had better," she said pleasantly, and he laughed, a short, genuine sound, and turned the gray mare and rode south out of town. She watched until he was small on the horizon, and then she went inside to help Mrs. Birch make supper, because standing at gates watching men ride away was not the kind of woman she was. The meeting with Mabel Cowpersmith happened the next morning in the back room of the general store, which smelled of flour sacks and dried pepper, and the particular dusty aroma of bolted cloth. Mabel Cowpersmith was exactly as Clayton had described, a woman of formidable presence in her late 40s, with sharp dark eyes and the bearing of someone who had built something and intended to protect it. She asked Louise very direct questions about curriculum, about discipline, about her views on the education of girls versus boys, and about what she would do if a parent objected to something she was teaching. Louise answered all of it directly and without hedging. She said that children learned best when they believed the person teaching them took them seriously. She said that girls deserved exactly the same academic instruction as boys, and she would not arrange it otherwise. She said that if a parent objected to something she taught, she would hear their concern and consider it, and if she found it without merit, she would say so politely and continue teaching. There was a silence after that last answer. Then Mabel Cowpersmith leaned forward slightly and said, "I like you, Miss Holloway. I think you are going to ruffle a few feathers in this town, and I think that will be good for it." "I don't ruffle feathers for its own sake," Louise said. "I just don't smooth them preemptively." "Even better," Mabel said. The school board met that same afternoon and voted 2-1 in favor of offering Louise the position formally. Frank Desmond, who was a large, red-faced man who seemed to carry an opinion of his own importance that was not shared by the immediate evidence, voted no without explaining his reasoning, which Reverend Aldous and Mabel Cowpersmith both ignored with the practiced efficiency of people who had been ignoring Frank Desmond for years. Louise Holloway was the teacher of Ember Flat School. She had a room, a salary, and a job. She had been in Kansas territory for 36 hours. She sat in her small room at the Reverend's house that night, the Colt on the bedside table, and wrote a letter to her mother in Missouri telling her where she was, and that things were going reasonably well, and that the territory was drier and flatter than she had imagined, but had a quality of light in the evenings that was unlike anything she had seen before, a kind of horizontal gold that turned everything it touched into something briefly extraordinary. She did not write about Clayton Underwood. There was nothing to write. But when she put the pen down and looked out the window at the darkening prairie, she found herself thinking about Creekwater eyes and a voice that had said she was the most prepared woman he had ever met, and she felt something in her chest that she did not name but that she also did not entirely ignore. School began the following Monday. 29 children showed up that first morning, ranging in age from 6 to 15, filing into the back room of the church with the variously curious, sullen, excited, or indifferent expressions of children everywhere who are not quite sure what to expect from a new teacher. They were ranch children and farm children, and a few who were neither but simply lived in the territory the way wild things live, by working and moving and doing what was required. Several of them had not had regular schooling in 2 years and showed it. Louise stood at the front of the room in her calico dress and looked at them all for a moment without speaking, and then she said, in a clear and carrying voice, "My name is Miss Holloway. I am going to expect things of you that you may not expect of yourselves, and when that happens I want you to tell me. We will figure out together whether my expectation is fair. Does that seem reasonable?" There was a beat of silence, and then a small boy in the front row with a gap between his 2 front teeth said, "What if you're wrong?" "Then I will say so and change my mind," Louise said. "Can you all say the same?" They could not all say the same, but the question did what she intended it to do, which was to establish that this particular teacher was not operating on the principle that authority was equivalent to correctness, and the shift in the room's atmosphere was tangible and immediate. She was in business. The weeks that followed were full in the way that good, hard work is full, with the satisfying density of time well spent. She organized the children by ability rather than age, which was somewhat unorthodox but was the most practical approach given the gaps in their learning. She taught reading and arithmetic in the mornings, and in the afternoons covered geography and history, and whatever science she could manage with the limited materials available. She wrote to the state superintendent's office in Topeka requesting textbooks and received a partial shipment 6 weeks later, which she distributed among the children with the solemnity of something precious, because books in a place like this were precisely that. She saw Clayton Underwood on Saturdays, which was when he came into town for supplies. At first it was brief a greeting at the store, perhaps a few words over Mabel Coppersmith's counter, but gradually it became something more, in the way that regular encounters in small towns always do. He would stop by the church school on his way through, ostensibly to speak with Reverend Aldous about the fencing situation on the town's north boundary, which genuinely did require ongoing discussion. But Reverend Aldous was often not there on Saturday mornings, and Louise was, and so she and Clayton would end up talking in the doorway of the church or sitting on the front step in the morning light, and the conversations accumulated into something. He told her about his ranch, 40 acres of good grass, 20 head of cattle, a garden his housekeeper had started, and that he had continued tending out of a loyalty to the effort even when he was not sure the garden was worth the water. He told her about the difficulty of getting fair prices from the cattle buyers in Caldwell, about a dispute with a neighboring rancher named Gene Hartley over a section of fence line that had been resolved without violence, but only barely, about his horse the gray mare whose name was Penny on account of her having cost him a great deal more than that. She told him about the children, about a girl named Rosa Reyes, the blacksmith's daughter, who was 12 years old and had a mathematical mind that Louise found genuinely astonishing, who could do in her head what most adults required paper for, and who had been told by more than one person that girls had no use for mathematics. About a boy named Tommy Wheeler, whose reading was far behind but whose memory for spoken stories was extraordinary, and who she was beginning to suspect was the kind of intelligence that doesn't sit still in a chair. About the way the light came through the church windows in the late afternoon, and fell across the children's bent heads, and made her feel, occasionally, that what she was doing here was genuinely important. He listened to all of it with the same quality of attention he had shown that first day, present and focused, and without the impatience that men often had when women talked about things that were not immediately connected to the man's own interests. It was the kind of listening that made you want to keep talking, which she was cautious about, because she had learned to be cautious about anything that made her want more than she had planned for. It was on a Saturday in late September, with the cottonwoods along the river turned gold and a cool edge in the morning air that announced the season's change, that something shifted between them in a way that was no longer possible to pretend was merely neighborly. They were sitting on the church step, and she was telling him about Tommy Wheeler's most recent revelation. He had, apparently, recited an entire chapter of geography back to her from memory after she had read it aloud only twice, word perfect, which she had been so startled by that she had made him do it again. And she was laughing as she told it, actually laughing, which she did not do as often as she would have liked. And when she looked up from her laughter, she found him watching her with an expression that was entirely open, entirely unguarded, and entirely unmistakable. She stopped laughing. Not because it was unpleasant, it was the opposite of unpleasant, but because the openness of it hit her somewhere deep, the way a chord hits you in a dark room. She was not used to being looked at that way. She was used to being assessed, evaluated, measured. She was not used to being looked at as though the sight of her happiness was something a person wanted to hold. "What?" she said, and her voice came out quieter than she intended. "Nothing," he said. "I just like the way you tell a story." She looked at her hands in her lap. Clayton. Louise. It was the first time he had used her given name, and she felt it as clearly as if he had reached out and touched her, which he had not done. She looked up at him. "I should tell you that I am not in Kansas territory to find a husband," she said. "I want that to be clear." "I understand that," he said, and he meant it, which she could hear. "I am here because I have a job I care about and children who depend on me, and I have worked very hard to build something for myself that belongs to me. I am not willing to lose that." "No one is asking you to lose it," he said. "Men ask that," she said. "Even when they don't say it with words, they ask it. A woman gets married, and then she belongs to the marriage and the house and the children, and somewhere in all of that she stops belonging to herself. I have watched that happen to women I love, and I have sworn I would not let it happen to me." He was quiet for a moment. A wagon rolled past on the street, raising a little dust. From somewhere down the road came the sound of hammering. "My mother taught school," he said at last quietly. "Before she married my father. She loved it. She talked about it the rest of her life, the way people talk about a place they had to leave. I always thought that was a tragedy. Not her marriage, that was good, they were good together, but the part where the one had to end for the other to begin." He looked at her steadily. "I don't think it has to be like that." "Most men do," she said. "I'm not most men," he said, and there was nothing arrogant in it. He said it the way you state a fact you have simply observed about yourself. She looked at him for a long moment in the September light, with the gold cottonwoods behind him and the wide Kansas sky overhead, and she thought that he might be telling the truth, and that she did not entirely know what to do with that possibility, but that she was not, at this moment, willing to simply dismiss it. "I know you're not," she said. And then she stood up and brushed her skirt and said she had papers to mark, which was true, and went inside. But she sat at the table in the church back room with the papers in front of her, and found that she was not looking at them, and that there was a warmth in her chest that had been building for weeks and was now clearly, unmistakably, something she was going to have to reckon with. October came in on a north wind, and with it came the kind of high prairie weather that had no patience for gradual change. One day warm, the next cold enough to see your breath, the sky cycling between an impossible blue and the low gray of approaching storms, with the brisk efficiency of a stage set being changed between acts. There were complications, as there always were. Frank Desmond, who had voted against Louise's hire and had never entirely forgiven her for being competent, began circulating an opinion among certain quarters that a woman who lived alone in a reverend's house and didn't have a family to look after had no business telling other people's children what to think. It was the kind of objection that had no logical foundation but didn't require one, being composed entirely of discomfort with the unfamiliar. Louise heard about it from Mabel Cowpersmith, who relayed it with the clear intention of warning Louise and the equal clear intention of making it known that Mabel considered Frank Desmond's opinion to be worth approximately the same as last year's almanac. Louise did not particularly lose sleep over Frank Desmond. What concerned her more was the situation with Douglas Farrow, which she had believed was behind her, and which turned out not to be entirely behind her. She found out on a Tuesday morning in late October, when Reverend Aldous received a letter addressed to her in care of the church. The letter was from her mother in Holt, Missouri, and its message was brief and anxious. Douglas Farrow had been asking questions about where Louise had gone. He had spoken to people who had known about the Kansas advertisement. He had told Louise's mother, with what the letter described as an unpleasant smile, that he intended to find her. Louise read the letter at the kitchen table while Mrs. Birch moved quietly around her, and she felt the cold weight of the thing settle in her stomach. But she did not feel what Douglas Farrow probably intended her to feel, which was fear that would paralyze. She felt instead a sharp, clarifying anger, and she folded the letter and put it in her dress pocket and spent the rest of the day teaching school with the focused intensity of a woman who has found something worth defending. That Saturday she told Clayton. She had not planned to. It was not information she felt obligated to share. But he could read her face. She had been slowly realizing that he was exceptionally good at reading her face, and when he said, as they stood at the livery stable while he waited for his horse to be shod, "Something's worrying you," she found that she simply told him. He listened without interrupting. His face did the thing it did when he was taking something seriously, which was go still and attentive, the way a good hunter goes still, not with aggression but with the full engagement of his faculties. When she finished, he said, "Do you think he'll actually come?" "I think he's the kind of man who does what he says when the cost is low enough," she said. "Caldwell is not a difficult journey from Missouri if a man is motivated." "And you think he's motivated?" "He is motivated by the belief that I owe him something I do not owe him," she said, "and men of that belief tend to be very persistent." Clayton turned his hat over in his hands twice, a thing she had noticed he did when he was working something out. "All right," he said. "What do you want to do?" She looked at him. "I want to handle it myself." "I believe you can," he said immediately, without any pause, without any of the reflexive masculine instinct to insert himself as the solution that she had fully expected. "I also want you to know that if you want someone standing nearby, I'll stand nearby. That's all." She looked at him for a long beat. That's all, he said steadily. "All right," she said, "thank you." And she felt the warmth in her chest move upward, and this time she did not entirely press it back down. Douglas Farrow arrived in Ember Flat on a wet Thursday afternoon in the first week of November, and Louise found out about it because Rosa Reyes, who had sharp eyes and was not oblivious to tension in adult conversations, came to her after school and said that a stranger had been asking for the schoolteacher at Cowpersmith's store. Louise went home, checked that the Colt was loaded. It was always loaded, but she checked, and then she went to Cowpersmith's store. He was still there. She had half expected he might be. Douglas Farrow was a man of average height and above-average self-regard, with sandy hair and small, pale eyes that she had once found unremarkable and had since come to read more accurately. He was wearing town clothes and trailed dust in equal measure, which told her he had ridden fast and hard to get here. He saw her come in. His face arranged itself into an expression of wounded reasonableness that she recognized as deliberate. "Louise," he said, "I've been looking for you." "I know," she said. "I've been here the whole time, Mr. Farrow. I work here." "I came a long way," he said. "I didn't ask you to." Mabel Cowpersmith, behind the counter, was watching with the focused stillness of a woman who had a heavy shelf bracket within arm's reach and was prepared to use it. Two other people were in the store. A ranch hand Louise did not know, and old Dr. Hemming, who was Ember Flat's only physician and whose hearing was not as diminished as people generally assumed. "You left without a word," Farrow said. "I left with several words," Louise said calmly. "I believe my words were no, I mean no, and please stop coming to my door, none of which require additional elaboration." His face darkened. "You're not being fair." "I am being entirely fair," she said. "I am being fair in a way you perhaps find unfamiliar, which is that I am treating my own preferences as equal in value to yours. Mr. Farrow, I came to Kansas Territory to teach school, and that is what I am doing. I have nothing for you here. I am asking you to go home." "And if I don't," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that she had heard before, the shift from wounded to something with an edge. She met his eyes directly. "Then I will speak to the town marshal, whose office is 4 buildings down and whose attention has, I suspect, already been engaged by the fact that a stranger is bothering the schoolteacher." She paused. "And then I will handle the remainder of the situation myself." She held his gaze without any allowance for him to misunderstand her meaning, and after a moment his eyes went briefly to her hip, where the slight line of the holster was visible under the calico fabric if you were looking for it. The color in his face shifted. He looked at her for another long moment, and whatever he saw there, the stillness, the absolute absence of fear, the plain fact of a woman who had come a very long way to be exactly where she was and had not the slightest intention of moving, seemed to recalibrate something in his assessment. "You always were the most stubborn woman I ever knew," he said. "I prefer to think of it as clarity of purpose," she said. He put on his hat. He looked around the store as if checking whether anyone here would provide him a different kind of audience, and finding no takers, he walked to the door. He paused in the doorway. "I hope Kansas is everything you wanted, Louise." "It is becoming exactly that," she said. He left. The bell over the door jingled. Outside, they heard his horse pick up and move down the street. There was a silence in the store. Then Mabel Cowpersmith put down the shelf bracket she had indeed been holding and said, "Miss Holloway, would you like a piece of hard candy? I feel like that warranted hard candy." Louise let out a slow breath. Her hands were not shaking. She checked specifically. They were not. "Thank you, Mabel," she said, and accepted the candy. She found out later that Clayton had come into town that afternoon. He had heard from a hand at the livery that a stranger from Missouri was in Ember Flat asking after the schoolteacher, and he had saddled Penny and ridden in. He had arrived in time to see Farrow walking out of Cowpersmith's store, had assessed the situation from the street, had seen Louise standing in the store window looking completely composed, and had understood immediately that she had handled it. He had turned Penny around and ridden back to the ranch. She found out about this from Rosa Reyes, who had apparently seen all of it from the corner near the church, and had found it interesting enough to mention to her teacher the following morning. Louise spent considerable time thinking about the fact that Clayton had come and then left without announcing himself, without inserting himself into the resolution, without requiring that she know he had been there, and that the decision to leave had required something of him, the deliberate restraint of someone who cared about the outcome and had chosen to trust her with it anyway. She thought about it for several days. Then she did something about it. She cooked a meal. This required borrowing Mrs. Birch's kitchen for an afternoon, and sending a message to Clayton by way of the Ray's boy who ran errands, asking if he might come to supper on Saturday after his supply run, as she wanted to thank him properly for his kindness in the week since her arrival. He came. He arrived clean-shaved and with his hat in his hands and a slightly careful expression that made her think he was uncertain of the meaning of the invitation, which she understood, because she had been uncertain of it herself when she sent it. Mrs. Birch had tactfully gone to visit her sister for the evening, a coincidence that Louise was fairly sure was not entirely coincidental, given that Mrs. Birch had been observing the situation between Louise and Clayton with the focused interest of a woman who had been rooting for them for some time. Supper was beef stew and corn bread, and a custard that Louise was quietly proud of, and they sat across from each other at the kitchen table with lamplight between them and the November wind pressing against the window panes, and she told him what she knew. "Rosa told me you came to town on Thursday," she said. He looked at his stew for a moment. "I heard there was a stranger asking after you, and you rode in and then rode back out. You had it sorted," he said. "I did," she said, "but you came anyway." "I came because," he stopped. Started again. "I came because I could not sit at the ranch and not do anything. I know it wasn't mine to do anything, and I know you didn't need me to, but I couldn't not come." She watched his face in the lamplight. He was not looking at her with any kind of pride in the gesture. He was looking at her as a man looks when he has simply told the truth about something that is too important to dress up. "Clayton," she said. "I know," he said. "I know you came here to build your own life and not to be looked after by someone. I know you're more capable than three of me put together." But Louise, he met her eyes directly, and she felt the full weight of his attention, which was a considerable thing. "I think about you every day. I have thought about you every day since you stepped off that stagecoach and told me you had 6 rounds and had been shooting since you were 12. And I don't know what to do with that except tell you, because I don't think I'm capable of pretending it's something else." The wind pressed against the window. The lamp flickered. She breathed in slowly. She thought about what she had said to him on the church step in September, about women losing themselves in marriages, about belonging to herself, and she thought about how carefully he had listened, and how everything he had done in the months since had been consistent with having genuinely heard her. "I think about you too," she said. "I have tried very hard not to, and I want you to know that it hasn't worked even a little bit." Something in his face changed. The careful expression fell away, and what was underneath it was open and warm and so unguarded that she felt the sight of it somewhere behind her sternum. "I'm not asking you to give up the school," he said. "I'm not asking you to give up anything. I know you could argue that a woman's property becomes her husband's under the law, and I know that is unjust, and I would like to tell you that I would sign whatever document a lawyer put in front of me to make clear that the salary you earn from that school is yours and belongs to no one else, because it is yours and it belongs to no one else." She stared at him. "You've thought about this?" "I have thought about very little else for approximately 3 months, he said, which might have sounded absurd if it had not clearly been true. She felt something loosen in her chest, some last, careful lock that she had been maintaining with considerable effort. She had been managing this feeling like a fire that needed to be kept from spreading. She had been methodical about it. And now, looking at him across the supper table in the lamplight with the wind outside and the stew going cold between them, she found that the effort of managing it was greater than the effort of simply letting it be what it was. "I would need to keep teaching," she said. "That is not negotiable." "Of course it isn't," he said. "I would need my own independence within any arrangement we made. My own money, my own decisions about how I spend my time." "Yes," he said without hesitation. "I have strong opinions," she said, "about education and about politics and about the way this territory treats people it should be treating better, and I am not going to stop having them or stop expressing them." "Louise," he said, and there was the warmth in his voice that she had been hearing under everything for months. "I fell in love with a woman who showed up in Kansas with one dress and a loaded pistol, and argued with a school board inside 12 hours of arrival. I'm not under any illusion that strong opinions are not included in the arrangement." She laughed. She felt the laughter move through her, and she let it, and then she looked at him, really looked at him across the table and the lamp and the cooling stew, and said, "I think I am in love with you, Clayton Underwood. I want you to know that I have fought it very hard." "I know you have," he said. "I've been watching you do it." "Was it obvious?" "Only to me," he said, "and possibly to Mrs. Birch." She laughed again, and then he reached across the table and his hand covered hers on the tablecloth, and she turned her hand over and let her fingers close around his, and it was the simplest and most significant thing she had done in a very long time. They stayed at that table for 2 more hours, talking with all the freed ease of people who have been wanting to talk this openly and are finally doing it. And when he finally stood to go, he held her hand at the door in the lamplight and looked at her with his whole heart in his face. "I don't want to rush you," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." "You don't need to rush me," she said. "I know my own mind." "I know you do," he said. He walked out into the November night, and she stood in the doorway and watched him go with a warmth in her chest so substantial and clean that it felt almost like arriving somewhere. The winter of 1878 to 1879 was a hard one on the prairie, cold enough to freeze the Kaskaskia solid for 6 weeks in January, with snow that came in horizontal on the north wind and settled in drifts against every vertical surface, and made the short walk from the Reverend's house to the church school feel like an expedition. But Louise kept school open through all of it, on the grounds that warmth and education were equally available in the church building, and that the children who lived close enough to come safely should come, and there were always at least 15 of them there. Clayton came to town as often as the weather allowed, and when the weather did not allow it, she found that his absence made the texture of the days different, thinner, like cloth from which a thread had been drawn. He proposed to her properly in February, on a Sunday after church, standing in the yard of the Reverend's house with the snow on the ground and his breath smoking in the cold air, and a small ring in his coat pocket that had belonged to his mother and that Reverend Aldous had been safeguarding for him for 3 weeks. She said yes. She said it clearly and without hesitation, because she had known her own mind on this subject for some time, and because the man standing in front of her in the February cold, with his whole honest face open and his hat in his hands, was, beyond any doubt she had been able to manufacture, the person she wanted to stand next to for the rest of her life. He put the ring on her finger. She stood on her toes and kissed him in the cold yard, which was brief and warm, and completely resolved the question of whether either of them had any remaining doubts. Reverend Aldous, who was watching from the front window, put down his cup of coffee and clasped his hands together with the satisfaction of a man whose investment of effort has paid a dividend. They were married in April, when the prairie had turned green and the meadowlarks were back along the river and the cottonwoods were in fresh leaf. The wedding was in the church, which was full. Ember Flat was a small town, and a wedding was not a small event, and every person in the valley who could reach town was there. Mabel Cowpersmith cried, which she did quietly and with dignity, and with the expression of a woman who would deny it afterward if asked. Tomas Reyes, the blacksmith, sat in the third row with his daughter Rosa beside him, and Rosa watched the whole ceremony with the grave attentiveness of a girl filing it away for future reference. Mrs. Birch was there, and the children, and a group of Clayton's ranch hands who had come in their best clothes and were collectively the most well-behaved they had ever been in public. Louise wore a new dress. She had made it herself from a length of blue cotton she had purchased at Cowpersmith's store, a good, honest blue, the color of the sky over the prairie in the late afternoon. It was the second dress she had owned since arriving in the territory, and it fit her perfectly, because she had cut the pattern herself. She kept the Colt. She just moved it to the nightstand on her side of the bed at the ranch, which was where it lived from then on. The ranch house was small, 2 rooms and a kitchen when she first arrived, with a lean-to at the back that had served as storage, and they spent the spring and early summer making it into something that was genuinely a home, rather than a place where one person happened to be storing himself between tasks. She put curtains on the windows that she had sewn from remnants. He built a bookshelf from good pine boards that took up most of one wall in the main room, because she had accumulated books steadily since arriving in Kansas, and they were currently living in unstable piles in 3 different corners. She organized the kitchen with the efficiency of a woman who had been running her own affairs for years and knew exactly where things should go. He rerouted the water barrel so it was closer to the kitchen door, because he had noticed that she was carrying it farther than necessary. These small acts of mutual accommodation, of reading each other's needs without requiring them to be stated, accumulated into something that felt like the deepest kind of partnership. Not the romantic kind that exists only in its highest moments, but the daily, practical, laughing, sometimes arguing kind that is built from 10,000 ordinary acts of paying attention. She kept teaching. The school grew. By the end of her first full year, she had 34 students, and by the middle of her second year, the school board had voted to build a proper schoolhouse, which was constructed that autumn on a good lot 2 blocks from the church. Louise stood in the empty building the day it was finished and walked slowly through the new classroom with its rows of pine desks, and its 2 windows letting in the clean prairie light, and its clean plank floor that smelled of new wood, and she felt something she could only describe as a completed intention. Clayton was there with her. He had come to town for the raising, had spent 2 days swinging a hammer alongside Tomas Reyes and 3 other men from the valley, and now he stood in the doorway of the new schoolhouse with his arms folded and a quiet smile on his face, watching his wife walk through the room that was hers. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Like something I built," she said. "You did build it," he said. "Most of it. You literally built the structure. You made it necessary," he said. "That's the harder part." She turned and looked at him across the empty room with the afternoon light coming in the windows, and the familiar warmth was there in her chest exactly where it always was, steady and substantial and entirely her own. In the spring of 1880, Louise discovered she was carrying their first child. She told Clayton on a warm May evening while they sat on the front porch of the ranch house and watched the long Kansas twilight do its slow and extraordinary work on the western sky, the violet, and rose deepening toward navy, the first stars appearing like punctuation, the prairie grassland going dark and quiet. He was quiet for a moment when she told him. Then he turned and looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, something stripped down to something essential, something past language. "Are you well?" he asked first, which was characteristic of him. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I'm extremely healthy, and I intend to teach through as much of this as is physically possible, and I would like you to understand that right now." "I understand it," he said, "and I intend to go back after," she said. "The school needs me, and I am not going to abandon 34 children because I became a mother." "Louise," he said gently, "I have never once considered asking you to." She let out a breath. "I know, I just needed to say it." "Then it's said," he said, and took her hand. They sat in the prairie dark with their hands together, and after a while she leaned her head against his shoulder, which she did when the weight of being entirely capable of everything got, occasionally, a little heavy, and he put his arm around her, which he did every time without comment and without ceremony because he understood that receiving support was not the same as needing rescue, and that was one of the many things she loved about him. Their son was born in the first week of December 1880, delivered by Dr. Hemming with Mrs. Birch attending, on a cold and still night when the snow was light on the ground, and the stars outside the ranch window were extraordinary in their number and brightness. Clayton was downstairs for the entirety of it in a state of barely controlled anxiety, and when Dr. Hemming came to the top of the stairs and said, "You have a healthy boy, Mr. Underwood," he was up those stairs in approximately 3 seconds. Louise was sitting up in bed looking exhausted and entirely herself, which he found deeply reassuring, and their son was in her arms, small and red-faced and making a concentrated, frowning expression as though he was already working something out. "Come meet him," Louise said. Clayton sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and his face did the thing it had done in the yard in February 2 years ago, completely open, completely unguarded, and she watched it happen and held it in her memory the way she had held the memory of his smile that first day outside the livery in Caldwell. "What shall we call him?" she asked. "You said you wanted to name the first one," he said. "I did," she said. "I want to name him James, for my father." "James Underwood," he said, and tried it in the air and then smiled. "That's a good, solid name." "He seems like a good, solid person," she said, looking at her son. "He has his mother's forehead," Clayton said. "He has his father's chin. Poor thing." She laughed, which made the baby's frown deepen into something that might have been surprise, and then Clayton's arm was around her, and his lips were in her hair, and they were both laughing quietly in the December lamplight while their son adjusted to the world. Rosa Reyes came to see the baby on his third day of life, and stood at Louise's bedside with the grave seriousness of a girl who was now 14 and had developed opinions about everything, including the state of mathematical education in Ember Flat, which she had communicated to Louise in some detail. She looked at James Underwood with a thorough assessment, and then declared him adequately formed, which was the highest praise Rosa generally offered. Louise laughed and asked her to help keep the smaller children's arithmetic lessons going until she was back on her feet, and Rosa agreed with barely disguised satisfaction, because she had been waiting to be given exactly this kind of responsibility for approximately 2 years. Louise was back at the schoolhouse within 6 weeks, which Dr. Hemming felt was slightly ambitious, and which she felt was entirely manageable, and both of them were right. James came with her for the first few weeks, sleeping in a box cradle that Clayton had built from the same good pine as the school desks, set in the corner of the classroom where Louise could see him, and the children could not easily reach him, which was a precaution that proved its necessity within the first day. The children were fascinated by him. Tommy Wheeler, who was now 14 and had grown into himself considerably since Louise had been teaching him, sat by the cradle at every recess break and talked to the baby in a low, careful voice about things he had learned, which Louise observed with a warmth in her chest that was different from the warmth of loving Clayton, but was of the same general family of feeling. Life on the ranch settled into the rhythms that good lives settle into, not without difficulty or disagreement or the occasional genuine frustration, but with the underlying security of two people who had chosen each other with full knowledge of what they were choosing and had no reason to regret it. Clayton expanded the cattle operation gradually and wisely, adding stock when the prices justified it and holding steady when they did not. Louise continued to teach, negotiated a raise to $28 monthly after her second year, which the board granted with less argument than she had anticipated, and Mabel Coopersmith championed with considerably more volume than was strictly necessary. There were hard things. There were 3 days in the summer of 1881 when a fever went through the valley, and 2 children from outlying ranches were sick enough that Louise sat up through 2 nights in a row while Dr. Hemming worked, and both children recovered, but the 3 days were some of the longest she had experienced. There was a dispute between Clayton and the neighboring rancher Gene Hartley that flared up again over a water right and required the intervention of a county mediator, and consumed several months of anxiety before it was resolved in Clayton's favor. There was a late October storm in 1882 that took the roof off one corner of the schoolhouse and required 2 weeks of repair. But there was also the morning in the autumn of 1881 when Rosa Reyes showed up at the schoolhouse with a letter from the Kansas State Normal School in Emporia, offering her a place in their training program for teachers. The result of a letter Louise had written on her behalf to the admissions board with a detailed accounting of Rosa's exceptional abilities. And Rosa's face when she read it was something Louise would never forget. Tomas Reyes, the blacksmith, cried when he heard about it, which he also tried to deny but which everyone in Ember Flat was aware of, and for which no one thought less of him. There was the evening in the fall of 1882 when Clayton came in from the south pasture, with a look on his face that she had learned to read as meaning something had gone unexpectedly well, and he told her that the cattle buyer from Wichita had paid him a price per head that he had not hoped to get, and that if the spring market held, they were going to be able to build the addition on the house he had been planning, a proper bedroom for James, and the room they would need if there were more children, which was a topic they had been discussing with some interest. There was the winter evening she read Tom Sawyer to James, who was 2 years old and did not follow most of it but sat in her lap with enormous attention while she read. And when she looked up, Clayton was sitting in the chair across the room with his boots off and the lamplight on his face, watching them both with an expression of such uncomplicated happiness that she had to look back at the book for a moment before she could look at him again. Their second child was born in the spring of 1883, a girl they named Clara, after Clayton's mother. She arrived in May, when the prairie wildflowers were at their fullest, and the meadowlarks were working very hard outside the bedroom window, and she was loud from the first breath and demonstrated from approximately the second day of her life a quality of opinion that Louise recognized immediately. "She has your stubbornness," Clayton said, on the third morning. "I prefer to think of it as clarity of purpose," Louise said, which was what she had said to Douglas Farrow 5 years ago, and Clayton laughed the way he always laughed when she said things he recognized, which was fully and without reservation, and she loved the sound of it in the room. James, at 2.5, approached his sister with the careful seriousness of a child who has been told that something important has arrived and is taking the briefing seriously. He stood at the edge of the cradle and looked at her for a long time with his father's brown eyes and his mother's measuring expression, and then he said, "She is very small." "She will get bigger," Louise said. "Will she come to school?" "When she is old enough." He nodded, apparently satisfied that the situation had a long-term plan, and went to find his toy horse. In the summer of 1883, Frank Desmond finally ran for the county commissioner's seat he had been wanting for years, and lost to a farmer named Ed Walsh by 31 votes, which Mabel Cowpersmith considered a public service, and said so with considerable volume at the general store. Frank Desmond, having lost, blamed several people in turn, none of whom paid much attention, and eventually decided to move his operation to Wichita, where he believed his talents would be better recognized. His departure from Ember Flat was mourned by approximately no one. The school board appointed a fourth member to replace him, which turned out to be Tomas Reyes, which was generally considered an upgrade of the highest order. Life continued. The town grew slowly, not dramatically, not the explosive growth of some of the cattle towns farther north, but the steady accumulation of people who came and liked what they found and stayed. A second doctor came in 1883. A lawyer set up an office in 1884. The church got a second coat of paint and new pews. The schoolhouse got new books. Louise taught through all of it. She had 38 students by 1884, and had begun pressing the county education board in Wichita for a second teacher, which was a campaign that would eventually succeed, but required considerably more correspondence than she felt was justified by a straightforward proposition. On a September evening in 1884, she and Clayton sat on the porch of the ranch house, which now had a proper addition on the north side and a vegetable garden that was entirely her project, and that Clayton maintained with great care whenever she was occupied elsewhere, and watched James, who was almost 4, attempt to teach Clara, who was 16 months and barely walking steadily, to throw a stick in the direction of the fence post. Clara fell down twice and threw the stick in the wrong direction once, and then sat down in the grass with the expression of someone who has decided to reassess the project, and James patted her on the head with the solemnity of a small person who has not yet learned to pretend he is not patronizing, and Louise made a sound that was almost a laugh and completely full of love. Clayton's hand found hers on the arm of the porch chair. She looked at him. The September light was doing what September light did in Kansas, the particular horizontal gold she had tried to describe to her mother in her very first letter from the territory, the light that turned everything it touched briefly extraordinary. It was turning him extraordinary right now, not that he required the assistance. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, as she did everything. She thought about a stagecoach platform in Caldwell in the summer of 1878, and a woman with one dress and a loaded pistol who had arrived in a territory she didn't know and had built, from that particular combination of materials, something she could not have imagined then. She thought about the man who had been sitting on a barrel outside a livery stable and had looked at all of it and said that she was the most prepared woman he had ever met, and had meant it in a way that contained no irony and no condescension, only genuine admiration for a person who had shown up with exactly what she needed and made the most of it. She thought about the schoolhouse with its pine desks and its prairie light. She thought about Rosa Reyes in Emporia becoming a teacher. She thought about Tommy Wheeler, who was 18 now and had told her last month that he intended to study law in Topeka and had asked her to write him a letter of recommendation, which she had done with great pleasure and even greater conviction. She thought about James in the grass trying to teach his sister about aim and trajectory. She thought about Clara reassessing her operational priorities from a seated position. She thought about Clayton's steady Creekwater eyes the first time she saw them, and how they looked now here in the evening light. "I'm thinking," she said, "that I came to Kansas territory with considerably fewer resources than this and considerably more uncertainty, and that things have turned out rather better than the arithmetic suggested they would." "The arithmetic always underestimates you," he said. "It does," she agreed. "It's the arithmetic's problem." He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles with a gentleness that was entirely natural to him and that she had never taken for granted. "I love you, Louise Holloway Underwood," he said. She felt the name settle over her, both parts of it equally hers, which was the arrangement she had always wanted and which he had always understood. "I love you, Clayton Underwood," she said. With unreserved and specific clarity, he smiled. The light turned gold. James stood up in the grass and declared that he needed to try the fence post again, and Clara pulled herself up to standing using his knee as a support and looked at the fence post with speculative interest and then took 2 very careful steps toward it and sat back down, but chose to do so this time as though it had been her plan all along. The prairie stretched south in the evening light toward the territory, wide and golden and entirely itself, and the meadowlarks were calling from the bluestem along the creek, and somewhere on the south horizon, a line of cattle was moving toward Caldwell on the old Kisham Trail, raising a small plume of dust against the amber sky. Louise sat on the porch of her home with her husband's hand in hers and watched her children in the grass, and the Colt was on the nightstand inside because it belonged to her and always would, and she taught school on Monday morning with 38 children who needed her. And on the schoolhouse wall she had pinned a letter from Rosa Reyes in Emporia that ended with the line, "You taught me that what I knew was worth knowing, Miss Holloway, and I will spend my whole life passing that on." And the weight of that sentence was something she carried with her every day, not as a burden, but as a kind of anchor, as the solid knowledge of what the work was for. She had come to the territory with one dress and a loaded pistol. She had built a life that fit her like her own skin. She was exactly, precisely, entirely where she meant to be. In the winter of 1885, the second teacher finally came, a young man named Arthur Banks from Topeka, fresh from the normal school, who was earnest and nervous and extremely good with younger children, which complemented Louise's particular strengths with the older ones perfectly. On his first day she showed him the schoolhouse and the records and the way she organized the reading groups, and she told him what she had told her students on her own first morning in Ember Flat, that she expected things of him, and that if her expectations were wrong she wanted him to say so, and that they would figure it out together. He looked slightly stunned. "That's a generous approach," he said. "It's a practical one," she said. "I am right about things more often when I am willing to be wrong about them." He thought about this for a moment and then said, "That makes complete sense," and she thought he was probably going to be fine. That same winter, Tommy Wheeler wrote from Topeka to say that he had been accepted to read law in the office of a practicing attorney, which was the path to legal qualification in Kansas in those years, and that he intended to come back to this part of the territory when he was qualified, because There were not enough lawyers who understood what the farmers and ranchers and the ordinary people of the plains actually needed. Louise read the letter to Clayton over breakfast, and he said that Tommy Wheeler was going to be very fine indeed, and she agreed. She wrote back to Tommy and told him she was proud of him, and then she went on with her day, which was full and her own, as all her days were. James started school in the fall of 1885, walking into the classroom where his mother taught with the slightly complicated expression of a child who is not entirely sure of the protocol. Louise greeted him with the same even attention she gave every student, and he found his seat and picked up his primer and got to work, because he was his mother's son and he understood at 5 years old that the work was the thing. Clayton watched from the back of the classroom for the first 10 minutes, leaning against the door frame with his arms folded, until Louise caught his eye with the look that meant this is a schoolroom, not a spectator event, and he touched his hat brim and departed with the expression of a man who had been caught and found it entirely worth it. Clara grew into exactly the person her first days had promised: forceful, funny, deeply affectionate when she chose to be, and possessed of a mathematical instinct that Louise recognized with a particular quality of joy. There would be time enough for all of that. The years settled into themselves, full and solid and ongoing. The territory continued its slow transformation: more settlers, more roads, more towns appearing on the horizon of the map. The Kishom Trail grew quieter as the railroad lines extended and cattle drives became less necessary. Caldwell, 17 miles north, continued its rowdy existence. The world moved forward in its rolling, imperfect way. In Ember Flat, Louise Holloway Underwood taught school and raised her children and argued with the county education board and loved her husband and sat on the porch in the September light with his hand in hers. And the Colt remained on the nightstand, still loaded, because it was hers and she was practical, and she had never once needed to apologize for being either. She had come to the territory with one dress and a loaded pistol, and a man sitting on a barrel outside a livery stable had looked at all of her and said she was the most prepared woman he had ever met, and it had turned out, in every way that counted, to be the most accurate thing anyone had ever said to her. She was prepared. She had built everything she intended to build. She was loved by someone who had seen her from the first moment and had never once asked her to be smaller than she was. The prairie light came horizontal across the grass in the late afternoon, turning everything it touched briefly extraordinary, and Louise Holloway Underwood sat in the middle of her own extraordinary life and held it close.